When it comes to analyzing Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and comparing it to Tolkien's original epic saga, there's a lot that has to be forgiven. After all, it's impossible to make a word-for-word adaptation, unless you're wanting to watch something extremely boring and extremely long. Yep, even longer than the 11 hours we already get with Jackson's extended cuts. But when reading the books, there's still some moments that really make die-hard fans think twice about this beloved film trilogy. Some moments that are removed cut a little too deep for Tolkien lovers. Plus, there are major changes that swap lines or character roles and alter the foundation of the story itself. And the long-standing debate between lovers of the books and films has been, could Peter Jackson and his team fit in some of these removed moments from the book? Typically, the answer is no, and everyone moves on. But today, I'm going to uncover 8 scenes that sit in the middle of the Two Towers film and last 25 minutes. And do you want to know what each of these scenes shares in common? They're all completely made up. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 29 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is usually the show where I analyze Peter Jackson's film adaptation of Tolkien's beloved books and point out all the differences. But today, we're diverging slightly from our typical format, as the scenes at this point in the Two Towers aren't really related to the book. Sure, they share the same characters and they are bookended by the actual plot, but for the most part, these scenes were completely fabricated by Jackson and his writers. The way I see it, some of Jackson's previous changes to the story are starting to catch up with him. Things like Aragorn's love story and overall destiny, and Eowyn's involvement in the journey to Helm's Deep are just a couple of moments that diverge from Tolkien's beaten path. Now, before we get into the nerdy stuff, I want to put a massive disclaimer on this video. If you're new here, just know that I love both the films and the books. In fact, I watched the movies before I ever even read the books. This series is simply an outlet for us nerds to get together and discuss all the changes between the two formats. So keep that in mind as we discuss these made-up moments and major changes, because it isn't me hating, but rather loving it so much that I took a whole week to research and write thousands of words for some random video on the internet. By the way, speaking of random videos on the internet, shout out to this commenter from one of my previous episodes. Each week I showcase one of my favorite comments, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Now, for the most part, I'm still going to try to stick to our usual format of addressing all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But the goal by the end of this video is for us all to officially put an end to the aforementioned debate. Did Peter Jackson have to cut Tolkien's work down for time, even when he added 25 minutes of his own made-up plot? So keep that in mind as we go through things, and at the end, leave your comment down below on what you would have preferred. As always, I'm going to start with a movie recap, and like I said, this is 25 minutes in the extended cut, so I'm going to do my best to blast through this. Let's pick up from where we left off last week, with the people of Rohan heading to Helm's Deep. We see Gimli talking to Eowyn as they travel, and he tells her that dwarf women often get confused for men because they're so similar in looks and stature. He then falls off his horse, and we see Eowyn laughing as she helps him up. We then see King Theoden speaking to Aragorn about how he should have taken better care of Eowyn. The movie then cuts to later in the day as people have set up camp, and Eowyn is going around offering food to people. She comes up to Aragorn and offers him some soup, which he takes but ultimately regrets later, and we get a bit of a conversation in which Aragorn reveals his true age of 87. The movie then cuts to Aragorn at nighttime, and we get a flashback of him having a therapy session with Arwen in Rivendell before he left on the journey with the Fellowship. In this flashback, he seems to be hesitant on embarking on this quest and leaving Arwen behind, but she insists that it's his destiny to go with Frodo. Then we cut back to the present as Aragorn is walking and Eowyn is next to him, and she asks him where the woman who gave him his necklace is. This then causes us to have another flashback as Aragorn stands with Elrond, and Elrond essentially tells him to dump Arwen because his love is killing her. Although Aragorn doesn't like this idea, Elrond convinces him to let Arwen go back with the other elves to the Undying Lands. We then see Aragorn packed up and heading to leave with the Fellowship, but Arwen catches him before he has officially snuck off. And then we see a breakup of sorts in which Aragorn tells her that they can't be together and tries to give back the necklace that she gave to him. Arwen, being the more mature one by a couple thousand years, tells Aragorn to keep the necklace anyway. And then the movie shifts back to the present as Aragorn snaps out of this daydreaming and tells Eowyn that the woman is going back to the Undying Lands with the rest of her kin. Before this moment can continue, however, we see a couple of our trusty Rohan men riding off to scout ahead, and one gets eaten by a warg. Realizing that they're under attack, Theoden has his people run to Helm's Deep while the riders Daughters of Rohan hold off the wargs. We see a cool fight sequence and some fancy footwork from Legolas, and then the climax of this fight is Aragorn's duel with an orc on a warg, which results in him being dragged off the edge of a cliff. After the fight is finished, Legolas, Gimli, and Theoden believe Aragorn to be dead, and they head back to Helm's Deep with the rest of the people. As the people arrive at the stronghold, we see our two children from earlier in the movie get reunited with their mother, and I'm not sure how she's alive, but oh well. Then as the soldiers return, Éowyn nearly faints as she learns of Aragorn's fate. We then see Theoden giving instructions to his men, and then hear the voice of Grima Wormtongue as he exposes the one weakness of Helm's Deep to Saruman, who is making a bomb. We then get to see the full strength of Isengard and the legions of Uruk-hai Saruman is sending forth, and we also see Merry and Pippin get a glimpse of it as well. Then the movie cuts to Aragorn as he floats along the river and gets saved by Brago the horse. And finally, our last scene is at Rivendell as we see Elrond convincing Arwen to go to the Undying Lands with the rest of the elves. And that is where we'll cut off for this week. Whew, man, I am out of breath after that, but we still have a lot to cover, so hang in there. First, let's address our character, timeline, and location changes. For characters, if we're looking at the closest chapter we have in common to this general time in the story, that means we're missing Erkenbrand and Éomer. Erkenbrand is simply mentioned by name, and he'll factor in more during future scenes, but Éomer is with Theoden and the rest while they ride out to battle. Remember, he never got banished, but was simply imprisoned and then released when Theoden was healed by Gandalf. As for characters who are included in these scenes but shouldn't have been, there's a whole bunch, but most notable would be Éowyn, since the women and children didn't go with the Rohirrim to Helm's Deep. And lastly, when it comes to character descriptions, the one that sticks out the most is Gamling. Gamling is given a larger role in the movie and travels from Edoras to Helm's Deep with Theoden, but in the book he is already at Helm's Deep and is clearly described as an old man. Next, when it comes to timeline, I feel like I can't even compare it, as these scenes are a jumbled up mess from what we get in the book. Most of these scenes are flashbacks, but as for the scenes we get of them traveling to Helm's Deep, I don't see why it would be a different timeline. So I guess it kind of gets a pass this week by default. Location, however, does not get a pass, as in the book we have a bit of a plot and location change in regard to the Rohirrim's path. You see, originally, the plan was to go to the Fords of Isen, where Theodred fell and where Erkenbrand was holding the line. It is only after a messenger intercepts them that they turn to Helm's Deep. So, since the movie only shows them heading to Helm's Deep, it excludes their original path to Isen. Also, the women and children, as we mentioned a couple episodes ago, are going to Dunharrow, not Helm's Deep. So they're on a completely separate path. Additionally, it is key to note that Helm's Deep looks very different according to Tolkien. Peter Jackson and Weta Workshops made a killer design that worked for the film, and I love it. But technically, the Hornburg was not attached to the dike, and there was quite some space between the dike and that stronghold. Plus, there were surrounding homes in the valley before the dike and stronghold, which we'll discuss later in the plot changes. But just keep that in mind for now. Now that I've already teased a couple of the plot changes, I think we should head into those. Like I said, I'll analyze the scenes and point out all the changes, but keep in mind that essentially every second of screen time is a change, since none of this happens in the book. But I'll do my best to point out the closest references in the books if I'm able to. Real quick, I wanted to give a shout out to Spotter Studio, as they have helped me in my YouTube journey. If you're part of the community, you might have seen my post about them in the community tab, but if not, they pretty much made the best tool possible for ideation and content creation. So if you're already creating content on YouTube or wanting to become a content creator, you need to check their tool out, as I use it every single week. And by the way, if you're like me and want to test something before you buy, they made a special offer for my community, which will give you 60 days for free. So if you don't like it, just cancel at any time. But I doubt that'll happen because it's a pretty incredible tool. Every free trial does support me and the channel, which allows me to keep creating these videos for you all. So thank you to Spotter Studio, and now let's get back to the video. First up, we need to address Gimli's brief dialogue with Éowyn. Obviously, the change here is the fact that this never happened. In fact, we can't even argue that it possibly could have happened, since Éowyn never accompanied them on their journey to Helm's Deep. And by the way, that goes for all the scenes including Éowyn. They aren't just scenes that Peter Jackson and his writers filled in the gaps on missing moments, they're straight up fabricated to fit the new narrative. Anyway, something I did want to mention was actually the line that Gimli spoke about dwarf women, as I think it is important to note that they didn't get that detail wrong. In the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote, quote, "They are in voice and appearance, and in garb if they must go on a journey, so like to the dwarf men, that the eyes and ears of other peoples cannot tell them apart." Although there is no text anywhere in Tolkien's lore that outright states female dwarves had beards, like what Aragorn says in the scene, I think it's safe to assume that they would have beards since they're so alike in appearance they can't be differentiated. Next, Theoden's brief dialogue with Aragorn is made up for the movie in order to further build out this character arc that Peter Jackson started for him. Plus, it helps us get more emotionally attached to these two characters' relationships, meaning King Theoden and Éowyn, which sets us up for a sob fest once we get to the Pelennor Fields. But we'll save that for the Return of the King episodes. Next, once again, since Éowyn wasn't on this journey with them, this soup scene could not possibly have happened. Also, although it is possible something might have been too disgusting to eat, I highly doubt we would have had an interaction like this. Aragorn is a ranger and is used to traveling for weeks at a time in the wild. I don't think some bad tasting soup would make him act like this. In fact, Aragorn strikes me as someone who would eat anything for sustenance without caring about the taste. But as for something they did get right, Aragorn is in fact 87 years old at this time. Next, we have our flashback of Aragorn and Arwen before he left with the Fellowship. And I think what is easiest is if we combine a few of these moments together. Namely, this conversation, then the flashback of Elrond confronting Aragorn, and lastly the final flashback of Aragorn trying to sneak off. Of course, Éowyn's inquiry about the necklace is mixed in there as well. But the main reason I want to combine all of these scenes is because they all revolve around one major flaw, which is the film's version of Aragorn and Arwen's relationship. You see, their true relationship is nothing like the movies. In fact, Arwen barely even shows up in the books at all. So taking in all these scenes together, here are the main changes. First, Aragorn isn't hesitant about joining Frodo, and then needs comforting from Arwen. In the book, he is dead set on fulfilling his destiny, which I'll explain here in a second. Second, Aragorn doesn't receive a necklace from Arwen in the book. This is a key part of the movie, as the necklace is central to Aragorn's character arc and love story with Arwen. But yeah, it's made up. The closest thing we get to it in the book is a gift that Arwen's grandmother, Galadriel, gave to Aragorn during their pit stop in Lothlorien. Galadriel gave him a brooch set with the legendary Elisar, also known as the Elfstone. This was actually passed down to Arwen, and then Arwen left it in the care of Galadriel for her to give to Aragorn should he pass through Lorien. This stone has a lot of meaning and importance that I can't get into right now, but a quick summary is that it has healing powers and signifies his kingship. Third, we come to Elrond's confrontation with Aragorn, if you can even call it that. The tricky part here is that I can't say outright that this doesn't happen, because it kind of does, just in a much different way than what the movie shows. You see, Elrond in the books wasn't too keen on a man marrying his elf daughter, but he doesn't tell Aragorn to let Arwen leave to go to the Undying Lands. Instead, in Tolkien's lore, he tells Aragorn that in order to have Arwen's hand in marriage, he must fulfill his destiny and claim his kingship. Then he'll be worthy of someone like Arwen. There's a much longer story to this, and by the way, none of this is really discussed in the Two Towers like what we see in the movie. This is all side lore that you get from Tolkien's other writings. But if you want to learn more about their love story, I linked a great video down below that summarizes it nicely. Finally, the fourth change regarding these Arwen-Aragorn scenes is simply the fact that he never tries to sneak off. He never breaks up with Arwen, but rather goes off to claim his kingship so that he can have her hand in marriage. And that's one of the main reasons why he's so motivated to go and do all of the things we see him do in the book. He's not only motivated by good, but he wants the girl, and this is the only way that he can get Elrond's blessing. Alright, so now that we've covered those flashbacks, let's move on to the next portion of our scenes here, which is the warg attack. And this is the closest thing that we actually get to something in the book. But no, there is no warg attack. We just hear about them. Since this scene actually somewhat relates to the chapter in the book, I figured I might as well summarize what Tolkien actually writes about. For some context, by the way, this is only the first few pages of the chapter called Helm's Deep in the Two Towers book. The first bit of the chapter covers their journey from Edoras to the fortress in the mountains, and of course we'll stop before we get to the actual battle, but here's what happens in the beginning. As they travel, they eventually run into a messenger who is riding toward them. He comes from the fight at Isen and reports that they are too late, and the enemy has broken through the defense. The messenger also informs Theoden that Erkenbrand has taken his men to Helm's Deep after his defeat at Isen, and he also says that there's no point in going to Isen as there are too many foes. After that report, Gandalf tells Theoden that he must go run an errand, and then tells him to go to Helm's Deep and await him there. By the way, this moment of Gandalf leaving them is probably what Peter Jackson used as inspiration for Gandalf leaving a few scenes before this one. Of course, this version is under a much different pretense, as Gandalf is recommending that they actually go to Helm's Deep, whereas in the movie, he's very against it. Anyway, Gandalf leaves and the Rohirrim continue to Helm's Deep. As they travel, they get word from scouts about the enemy marching behind them, and they also hear of the attacks happening as they travel, which include wildmen and orcs burning the Westfold villages and warg riders attacking the Rohirrim as well. This is what inspires the fight we see in the Two Towers movie. However, like I stated before, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Theoden never actually have a fight like this. They're simply aware that it's going on in the land around them as they travel. Plus, another key difference is the death of Hama. At the beginning of the warg attack, Peter Jackson kills off this key character, which I think is very unfortunate because, spoiler alert, Hama dies a very courageous death at Helm's Deep in the book. Anyway, back to the last parts of these pages, eventually they do make it to Helm's Deep and meet Gamling, who gets them up to speed on the situation. Erkenbrand left a while ago to rally the troops in Rohan, and there are families and goods stored up in the Hornburg. Now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't you say there weren't women and children with them? Well, like we discussed in the location category, Helm's Deep looks a lot different in the books, and it includes a lot of homesteads in the valley before the stronghold. So all the women and children in the Hornburg at this point are people who lived in the surrounding homesteads and had retreated because of the attacks. They are not the families from Edoras. Anyway, that's about all that we get from this part of the chapter, and I don't want to go any further because in the book, the attack happens almost immediately, as the enemy had been close behind them the whole time. But now that we've covered that, let's go back to our made-up version of things and resume the key changes there. Obviously, since the warg attack doesn't happen in the book, Aragorn never falls to his supposed death. Also, that means that there's no depressing moment of Éowyn thinking Aragorn had died like what they show in the movie when the rest of the people arrive at Helm's Deep. Next, let's talk about Grima and Saruman, as we get a brief glimpse into Saruman unleashing his forces. The devilry of Saruman is a real thing, and there are explosives, so that's not made up. But the part of Merry and Pippin seeing the army marching away from Isengard is made up. At least, I think it is. I couldn't find anything relating to it in the book, but maybe I skipped over a page. So let me know in the comments if I missed something there. Now we have our last couple of changes / made up moments, with the first one being Aragorn getting saved by Brago. Again, he never fell, so this never happens. Aragorn is with Theoden and the Rohirrim the whole time that they're going to Helm's Deep. And lastly, Elrond doesn't convince Arwen to leave Middle-earth and go to the Undying Lands. This is kind of a bad dad move here, and I feel like at almost 3,000 years old, Arwen is able to make her own choices, as she does in the books. The next thing we see after watching Arwen walk away with her fellow elves is Galadriel and Elrond having a ring-bearer Skype session of sorts, but that is a topic for next week. As for this week, thanks for bearing with me as I covered some of the toughest portions of the Two Towers. I gotta be honest, out of all the episodes I've done, this one has been the hardest. I'm just so used to comparing the books to the movies, so it was tough to take on a set of scenes which pretty much have no correlation to Tolkien's original story. I guess this is just giving me a small taste of what covering The Hobbit's gonna be like in a couple years, so wish me luck. But anyway, I want to hear from you. Like I asked in the beginning, do you think Peter Jackson could have removed these made-up moments in order to keep some of the more book-accurate scenes that people argue were cut for time? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.